Hello and welcome to Psycho Killer, the true crime podcast about Britain's worst criminals. I'm Simon Ford, a writer and journalist.
And I'm Jack Morrell, a former major crime detective. My job may have been to investigate crimes and to put criminals away, but I'm fascinated by their behaviour, in particular, what makes them tick.
If you're going to be murdered, it's almost always by somebody you know, even if that somebody is a recent or casual acquaintance. The psycho killer in this podcast came to the attention of the police because he took out somebody he didn't know at all.
His name was Kenneth-Noye, a name that's rarely been far from the headlines in the years since he stabbed Stephen Cameron to death in a road rage attack on the M25 in Kent.
A Land Rover travelling at speed overtook the van Stephen was in. When both vehicles stopped at traffic lights, he and the other driver began arguing. Then after a fight, Stephen was fatally stabbed. The ferocity of the attack has shocked police.
Why did this occur? Why would someone want to use such extreme violence to which is, after all, a fairly minor incident compared to some of the things we have to deal with?
Officers at the incident room here say they've been inundated with calls offering information, and they're now looking at other road rage cases and their possible links with the murder of Stephen Cameron.
"21-year-old Stephen Cameron was an electrical engineer who lived locally with his dad Ken and mum Tony. On the 19th of May 1996, Stephen agreed to let his 17-year-old fiancée, Danielle-Cable, practice driving his van on the M25, the London orbital motorway. Danielle had just passed her driving test and had never driven on a motorway. She was apprehensive and wasn't used to driving the van, but Steve said it would be okay. It was Sunday and the traffic was light. At the Swanley interchange, being cautious, Danielle got in the way of a Land Rover Discovery trying to join the motorway. No harm was done, but the middle-aged man at the wheel was furious. He pulled in front of Steve's red van. Steve in the passenger seat made a gesture. When both vehicles stopped at traffic lights, the Discovery driver got out to have a word. Steve got out too, and that's when the fight started. Steve was big and strong. He fought off the older man, but it wasn't over. The Discovery driver returned to his vehicle, took a lock knife, came back and stabbed Stephen twice in the chest. As Stephen lay dying in Danielle's arms, the killer casually took out his phone, walked back to the Land Rover and drove away. It was like he'd got something out of his system.
I just hope he's watching this now and looking at my face and remembering that I was pleading with him not to kill the person I loved more than anything.
He said nothing, but what was the expression on his face when he ignored that appeal?
Just looked at me like I was dirt.
That's how Stephen Cameron met his death in May 1996. What made his murder stand out from other road rage incidents, and indeed other murders, was that his killer was a villain. Kenneth-Noye, a career criminal who'd already killed a police officer and got away with it.
Kenneth-Noye, a nasty piece of work. Was he a psycho, or was it just something about driving a car and being cut up getting onto the motorway that triggered him? And if so, is there a psycho within all of us? Because there is something about being behind the wheel of a vehicle that turns respectable members of society into thugs and idiots consumed by raging fury to perform dangerous and sometimes fatal acts.
Where complete strangers interact purely because they happen to be travelling on the same stretch of road. If one of them happens to have some of those psychopathic traits, we have a problem. Imagine where both have a similar antisocial disorder. ruthless, impulsive and lacking empathy isn't a problem for a psychopath, and they're never in the wrong, are they?
However, we all know that people who use their vehicles as weapons end up in court. That is, if they live to tell the tale. There was a case near me recently. 2 vans coming off a dual carriageway. The road narrows to 1 lane and the van in front has to brake to avoid colliding with a 3rd vehicle. The driver of the van behind sees red, overtakes, just misses an oncoming car, clips the front of the leading van, loses control and slams into a tree. He died. The other van driver was acquitted of causing death by dangerous driving, but he spent a year waiting for the case to come to court. All he did was annoy the bloke behind him, whose flash of temper cost him his life. And for what? The privilege of being in front. Road rage incidents are where the vehicle creates an environment for a driver's anger to intensify. Steve Cameron's murder is typical of similar incidents all over the world. An inexperienced or timid driver makes a minor error causing someone to blow their top, and in some cases the situation escalates, sometimes with fatal consequences. Jack, when we look at old cases, you're always telling me that the car has got a lot to answer for. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's my opinion. It's not the findings of research by criminologists. But you've only got to look around, haven't you? The evidence is everywhere.
I think you said that the car has made us selfish and antisocial. How so?
I'd believe that, yes. We seem to feel protected by the metal shell of a car, and we react differently, don't we? We treat the car as our private space, and we don't like it when that space is challenged. It may well be men who are the main road rage protagonists, but women also behave aggressively when behind the wheel.
Well, yeah, you're right. I confess, I'm more likely to use colourful language when I'm driving, put it like that. But I don't when I'm walking down a crowded street and people just get in the way. We seem to get more stressed and aggressive when we're driving, don't we? We don't behave like that when we're walking through town.
No, we don't. In fact, when a pedestrian gets in another's way, it usually ends in a polite apology, and everyone just carries on with their business.
So the moment when Kenneth Noye stabbed Stephen Cameron on the M25 in Kent back in 1996, it's a notorious road rage incident, notorious not just by its random nature, nor by the fact that Stephen Cameron died, not even because Noye the killer hightailed it to Spain, where he evaded capture for 2 years in some kind of gangster's paradise.
No, it was the fact that Noye was a villain who'd spread his tentacles into not only the organised crime network, but also the police. Kenneth Noye is an old man now, but he's still as hard as they come. He was born just after World War II in Bexley-Heath, South London. His father ran a post office and his mother a dog racing track. He was light-fingered from the start. At 5, his mother caught him nicking money from the till in Woolworths while she was chatting to the shop assistant. Noye went to Bexley-Heath Boys Secondary Modern, where he was the school bully. In fact, he ran a protection racket, and he left school at 15 and got a job selling bicycles. The problem was the bicycles were stolen. Noye cleaned them up and removed any identifying features and sold them.
What, like the frame number?
Quite. And he spent a year in Borstal for this botched-up bike scenario, before returning to the world of honest work. Then he started dating a legal secretary. She worked for a barrister. Young Kenny was already making connections that would suit his criminal ambitions.
By this stage, Noye was also a police informant, and it's alleged that by the age of 30, he was associated with corrupt officers, bent coppers. He became a Freemason in January 1980, a member of the Hammersmith Lodge in London, and his application was supported by 2 police officers. They gave Noye's occupation as builder. According to press reports, a lot of coppers were members of the Hammersmith Lodge. Undoubtedly, most of them were fine, upstanding representatives of the law enforcement community, but all it takes is one bad apple. Noye's membership lapsed in 1987. He owed the lodge 2 years' subs, and then wallop, he was drummed out of the Freemasons when they found he had a criminal record. This is all according to a letter from the Grand Secretary of the United Grand Lodge of England that was published in December 1996. Now, one of Noye's police contacts persuaded a customs official to leave him alone, while tip-offs to the Sweeney Todd, Flying Squad, were how he dealt with rival criminals. He grassed them up, and the police turned a blind eye to his activities.
And what activities were these? Well, Noye had built up a legitimate haulage business as cover for his criminal activities. He bought a bungalow with a large plot of land. He wanted to build a mansion, but was refused planning permission. Then, miraculously, you might say, the bungalow burnt down. The cause, an electrical fault. Soon afterwards, Noye got the planning permission he wanted for the now vacant lot. Convenient.
So, Jack, when you were a cop in the 1980s, just how easy was it for criminals like Kenneth Noye to form close relationships with serving police officers?
I think it's fair to say, Simon, that the lines were blurred in those days. Relationships were more familiar and associations did form. Criminals with wealth and influence are by their nature more difficult to investigate. It takes time and a lot of resources. The whole management of criminal informants was casual and open-ended in those days.
So what's stopping the same thing happening now?
Well, any informant has to have a shelf life. They are risk assessed and need to have a purpose. The registration of informants now is regulated and more specific. It has to be proportionate to any case. Any police informer should be treated very carefully. But where their motivation is to remove a rival criminal from circulation, that's a red flag and comes with a serious health warning.
I suppose their information has to outweigh the risks, yeah?
Yeah, and by risk, we also mean risk to the police organisation. Each use of an informant must ask whether the information could be obtained by less intrusive means.
The bullion thieves forced their way into the top security depot beneath the Heathrow flight path just after 6 o'clock this morning.
Then, in 1983, Noye was suspected of involvement in the notorious Brinksmat bullion heist, at the time Britain's biggest ever robbery.
The gang was after £3 million in cash. The gold was in fact an unexpected bonus. There were diamonds too. The haul was worth the equivalent of £87 million in 2021. Suspecting Noye of running the laundering operation, the police started surveillance, including hiding an undercover officer in his garden. But Noye discovered Detective Constable John Fordham and stabbed him to death. Jack, what a disaster for the police. And is it routine to set up an undercover surveillance like that?
No, it's certainly not routine. There were 2 police officers actually deployed in Noye's garden, and there would have been an extra support in place. It's an expensive, high-risk tactic. John Fordham, apparently, was 45 years old and described as one of the Met's most experienced surveillance officers. He'd been deployed in the vicinity of Kenneth Noye's home, Hollywood Cottage, in West Kingsdown, Kent.
So we assume they wanted to know who Noye was associating with?
Yes, and don't forget, this was 1985, so the opportunities for technical surveillance were very basic. It's worth also saying that Hollywood Cottage was not a quaint little place either. It was a huge 5-bedroomed mock Tudor mansion. It had a barn and stables for 4 horses. Above the stables there was a games room, a snooker room and a gym. This gangster's paradise was set in 20 acres of grounds. On top of that, the estate was flanked by high walls.
It sounds more like a compound than a cottage, the kind of place where Pablo Escobar would have felt at home.
Very much so. And now on the night in question, an associate of Noye, a man named Brian Reeder, arrived at the house. DC Fordham and his colleague moved forward to get a better view, but Noye's Rottweiler dogs sensed the officer's presence.
But of course, in Noye's defence, he didn't know they were police officers, did he?
No, that's true. But what played out went beyond the actions of a reasonable man protecting his property. The officers tried to escape. DC Fordham's colleague was first over the wall, but Noye and Reader caught up with him before he could do the same. John Fordham was stabbed 10 times and bled to death in minutes.
This does sound more like Colombia than Kent in the 1980s, doesn't it? And what would normally happen when a surveillance is compromised like that?
Well, as soon as it's 1-0 to the bad guys, isn't it? It empowers the criminal. They have the upper hand. What would normally happen is that a disgruntled villain would make a phone call to the police, and his lawyer, of course, to make it official, to complain about this police harassment. Such a controlled response wasn't in Noye's character, though, was it? As John Fordham was about to find out.
This was Britain in the 1980s. Fordham wasn't armed, no Glock in a shoulder holster. How was he supposed to defend himself? What could he do in that situation?
Talk his way out of it. He wouldn't have sought a confrontation. I mean, we can only assume that he told Noye and Reader that he was a police officer and pleaded for his life.
And his colleague on the other side of the wall, he had to live with that. Well, the jury had to live with their decision too. Noye and Reader stood trial for John Fordham's murder, but the jury accepted he'd acted in self-defence. Noye blew kisses in their direction when the not guilty verdict was read out. Maybe some justice was achieved the following year when Noye was convicted of handling some of the stolen Brinks Mat gold, which turned up under the patio and beneath the swimming pool at Hollywood Cottage. Ever the joker, Noye had rigged up the stereo to play the theme from Goldfinger. After conviction, Noye's attitude to the jury was somewhat different from when he was acquitted of murder. This time he shouted, "I hope you all die of cancer."
Such a charming man. I bet he'd behaved himself up to that point too. Collar and tie, maybe even some of those clear glass dummy spectacles bought especially for the occasion. All part of the ploy to give the jury an image of a respectable, clean-cut businessman.
Noye's business was actually to melt down the Brinks Mat gold. He mixed it with copper coins in an attempt to disguise its origin. Although, as you said, Jack, 11 gold bars from the robbery were found at his mock Tudor mansion. Bang to rights, I'd say. Noye got 14 years. He was released in 1994 after serving just 8 of them.
And let's not beat about the bush. Kenneth Noye was released from prison too soon. Still angry and clearly not rehabilitated. These factors would play their part 2 years later in that fateful confrontation on the M25.
So, fast forward to the 19th of May 1996 and the road rage murder of Stephen Cameron on the slip road at Swanley Interchange. What did the police have to go on?
Well, the eyewitness accounts gave them a description of the assailant and a vehicle, at least the make, model and colour. It was a Land Rover Discovery.
Apparently there were 17,000 Land Rover Discoveries registered in the UK at that time. How do you go about eliminating all of those?
Well, you would have to set up some parameters and to ask the police national computer to group these vehicles according to each category. The obvious being those registered in Kent and then the surrounding areas, maybe those that already had a marker on them showing some pre-existing police interest.
And the colour and other features, they'd be important, right?
Yes, but you have to remember the DVLA are not always told about modifications to vehicles. This can apply to the colour too, whether it's been changed or just open to interpretation. It can be misleading, so you have to treat that with caution.
And what about the registered keeper? And I should explain, in Britain, the registered keeper is different to the owner of a vehicle. The registered keeper should be the person who's using the vehicle and keeping it, which can sometimes be different to the owner of the vehicle or the person who's responsible for paying for it. Take a company car, for example. The car is owned by the company, but the registration documents should show the registered keeper to be the person who uses it on a daily basis, such as an employee.
Well, basic checks would be made against the name and address, but again, the keeper is not necessarily the driver. It would need a bit more to make it stand out.
Well, good news here. The police did identify one that stood out, registered to someone in Kent called Anthony Francis. So, once you believe you know the vehicle involved, it's just a case of finding it and eliminating any others, right?
Finding it, yeah, priority one. Eliminating the others, that's something for later, before the trial. I recall a case, it was a murder case, where the use of a particular vehicle was crucial to the prosecution. The vehicle used was a distinctive gold colour and the original factory colour from that year's model. So, to be absolutely thorough and to avoid any doubt the defence might try and conjure up, we needed to find all the others and to establish that they weren't anywhere near the crime scene on the night in question.
Well, within a couple of weeks from the day in question, Noye was discovered to have been in northern Cyprus, where his son happened to live. The Cypriot police made some discreet inquiries, but Noye had moved on.
The police were officially looking for Anthony Francis, the registered keeper of the dark green Land Rover. By December, and unfortunately for Noye, they discovered that the Land Rover had also made its way over to Cyprus, being unloaded in Kyrenia in July, just a few weeks after the murder.
Noye's trail was getting colder as the months passed. The media were all over the case because of the connection to Brink's Matt, and throughout 1997, newspapers continued to speculate on Noye's whereabouts. Various theories suggest he'd undergone cosmetic surgery and was living in Brazil, or he was running a timeshare operation in northern Cyprus, or he was financing a drug smuggling ring in Russia, and given his track record, these were all plausible theories.
However, in July 1998, over 2 years since Stephen Cameron's murder, British and Spanish detectives began to show an interest in a £470,000 villa in Spain. It was near Cadiz, a large port on the Mediterranean coast. This time, the surveillance was backed up by experts from MI5 and the government communication headquarters in Cheltenham. It was Noye, living the dream in Spain, and he was arrested on the 28th of August in the resort of Barbat.
Cameron's girlfriend, Danielle-Cable, who'd witnessed his murder, was secretly flown out to Spain, where she positively identified him as the killer. Noye's appeal against extradition took 7 months, and he was finally extradited to Britain in May 1999, 9 months after his arrest. He went on trial 10 months later. A different type of case and a different jury. How would Noye handle the Spanish Inquisition? Had he got his criminal network to pull off another escape act?
The trial was at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court for London. In exceptional cases, trials may be referred to the Old Bailey from other parts of England and Wales. At the trial, Mr. Bevan QC spoke for the prosecution. It was claimed that Noye swerved in front of a small van driven by Miss Cable, who'd passed her driving test 7 months before as she drove with Mr. Cameron to London.
Mr. Cameron shook his head in disapproval, and when the two vehicles came to a stop at the next set of traffic lights, Mr. Noye got out of his car and walked towards the couple, angry at the way in which that van had been driven. Stephen Cameron's decision to get out of that red van and deal with this potentially ugly situation cost him his life.
Mr. Noye punched Mr. Cameron hard in the eye, and he retaliated by kicking him, the court heard. Miss Cable described how she saw Mr. Noye, who had a blank expression on his face, fumbling in the pockets of his short-sleeved jacket, as if he was trying to find something. She had pleaded with her boyfriend to get back in the van, but he told her to stand back.
He broke away from Mr. Cameron. He went towards his discovery, and it appears he acquired a knife. He returned to face Stephen with the knife in his hand, ready for use with the blade out. Stephen Cameron remained unarmed, empty-handed. He lunged at him and stabbed him twice in the chest.
During her evidence, Miss Cable said the knife was 4 inches long and that Mr. Noye had approached her boyfriend with his hand out, the blade towards Steve.
He was kicking him. I was scared. I was screaming and running, calling for someone to help me because I was frightened. The next thing I saw was Steve coming towards me. The other man was driving off.
Mr. Bevan described how the first wound went to a depth of 16 centimetres, 6 inches, and had penetrated Cameron's heart.
The direction of the wound was upwards, backwards and inwards. The second wound went to a depth of 18 centimetres and penetrated his liver. According to one of the pathologists, Stephen was rotating away from the knife when he was stabbed.
Cameron collapsed, never to regain consciousness, and was declared dead at hospital 50 minutes later. Mr. Bevan said that Noye now admitted to having stabbed Mr. Cameron, insisting it was in self-defence, despite the fact that he denied being the second driver during the extradition proceedings. It was also reported that as Mr. Cameron's life slipped away, Mr. Noye was busy on his mobile phone. Probably believing someone had taken down the registered number of his car, he stabbed the victim out of anger and maybe pride, because the younger man was getting the upper hand in the fight, prosecution lawyers claimed. During cross-examination by Stephen Batten QC for Mr. Noye, Miss Cable admitted Mr. Noye did not look angry when he got out of his car. He suggested that Mr. Cameron started the fight and had the upper hand.
It is the fact that you told the police, and indeed told us, far less than you really saw, because you found it perhaps totally naturally difficult to admit that any of this was Stephen's fault.
Miss Cable replied,
"No, I don't believe it was his fault at all."
When asked if her fiancé had something of a temper, she'd said she'd never seen it. Mr. Batten asked if she knew about him losing his temper at their engagement party when he urinated on a neighbour's fence and banged on his door. She admitted that she'd seen them fighting. Mr. Batten asked,
"Would you say that Stephen was a young man who thought he could take care of himself without too much difficulty?"
Miss Cable said,
"Yes, I suppose he thought he could take care of himself."
The prosecution was able to put other facts before the jury. How Noye had bought the Land Rover in 1995 from a man called Terence Hole and registered it in the name of Anthony Francis, quoting an address in Bridgeon Road, Bexley, Kent. This belonged to a friend, Peter Horton. Mr. Noye called Mr. Hole and Mr. Horton on several occasions in the hour after the attack. He also spoke with his wife and son. At 10:42 p.m. that evening, he called a private aviation company owned by another associate.
He took the necessary steps to stop anyone telling the police the true identity of the driver,
said Mr. Bevan. The following day, he flew out of the country by private helicopter to a golf course in France, taking with him a briefcase full of cash. And from there, he went to Spain, probably using a false passport with the name of Mr. Green. Mr. Bevan said that the Land Rover Discovery driven by Noye had never been found, but offered two other bits of evidence. A similar Land Rover had been taken to a scrapyard owned by one of his friends, Tommy Lee, in Dartford, Kent. This vehicle was probably dismantled and destroyed. An AA membership card in the name of Kenneth Noye was found there by detectives. On the day after the murder, a man giving the false name of John Grittins brought a Land Rover Discovery from a dealer in North London, paying with £12,000 in a plastic bag. The address the man gave was false, and the car was later found outside Mr. Noye's home. So, what was all that about? A deliberate trail of misinformation? Noye knew the police were looking for the Land Rover registered to Anthony Francis. He'd already made sure it had been taken out of the country, so he made an elaborate plot to put another Land Rover in his possession in order to confuse the case, to give him the opportunity to say people were mistaken about what Land Rover he used.
Classic smoke and mirrors.
This man had a lot of connections, didn't he?
He certainly did, so much so the jurors in the case had police escorts throughout the trial to make sure they weren't nobbled.
Lord Justice Latham said,
"It is, I am afraid, necessary to take these steps just to ensure there is no problem about people trying to approach you. There are many people who have an interest in this case and its outcome. I have arranged for you to be provided with escorts that will, I am afraid, affect your daily life to some extent."
But he insisted that this should not be seen to be
in any way prejudicial
to the defendant.
It is absolutely vital that Mr. Noye is given a fair trial. Noye told his barrister, Stephen Batten QC, that he was going to feed his dogs before going to a pub on that Sunday morning. He claimed he was not the aggressor. Far from it. As he came onto the M25 slip road leading to the M20, he saw a red rascal van being driven by someone he thought he recognised as the blonde girlfriend of a friend, Mickey Taylor. As he stopped at the traffic lights, he saw the vehicle flash its headlights at him. It was then he thought he saw Mr. Taylor in the passenger seat.
I got out. I was going to tell him where I was going to have a drink.
Mr. Noye, who told his barrister he was carrying the lock knife in his jeans pocket, said he immediately realised his mistake when the other man got out of the van.
As he came towards me, I said, "Sorry, mate, I thought you were someone else." He was swearing and said, "You will be." I could see his face and I knew I was in trouble.
How awful for him.
Yeah, he was playing the self-defence card again, explaining that he'd fled because the police hated him and he knew he wouldn't get a fair trial.
This time, his claim of acting in self-defence fell on deaf ears. Kenneth Noye was found guilty of the murder of Stephen Cameron. The jury returned a majority 11-1 verdict after deliberating for nearly 8.5 hours. Lord Justice Latham gave Noye a life sentence.
At a press conference after the trial, the family spoke of their continuing grief.
This is not a joyous occasion. Our lovely son Stephen is dead, and our lives will never be the same again. We will never feel the happiness that we once had. It is hard to put into words our feelings. We are still experiencing overwhelming grief.
Incredibly, despite the evidence of his wealth, Noye got legal aid amounting to about £250,000. There was an inquiry. Auditors found the proper procedures had been ignored. One of the officials responsible for Noye's financial support in the Lord Chancellor's office resigned. Another was disciplined. Miss Cable got a new identity under the Witness Protection Programme, having been praised by police for her courage in giving evidence in the presence of Noye and his associates. Lord Justice Latham made no recommendation in open court about how long Noye should serve, but he wrote to the Lord Chief Justice and the Home Secretary recommending a tariff of 16 years. On the 6th of June 2019, aged 72, Kenneth Noye was released from prison after serving 20 years.
Breaking news has just come into us in the last few moments regarding Kenneth Noye, a former gangster who was convicted of murder. He has been released from prison according to the Ministry of Justice.
Despite recommending his release, the parole board said that he remained a risk due to his readiness to carry and use weapons, and because Noye was not able to resolve arguments reasonably at key moments, as he did not always control extreme emotions well.
You can say that again.
So, Jack, going back to our theme of road rage, the murder of Stephen Cameron by Kenneth Noye is at the extreme end of the spectrum, isn't it?
Well, it's a tragedy for all concerned, but if you take away Noye's newsworthy reputation, it's not that remarkable. Nor is it a complex case. It was pretty straightforward.
In what way?
Well, it was the coming together of two men who'd got fired up over a piece of inexperienced driving. The men locked horns, like a pair of rutting stags. The older of the two was armed with a knife and in his rage used it with fatal consequences. The police had an eyewitness and a distinctive car to trace. Nothing remarkable about that either.
Are road rage cases prosecuted as an assault? How does it all work?
Well, most road rage incidents aren't reported, let alone prosecuted.
But where they are and there is violence, how are they treated by the police and by prosecutors?
Usually those involved don't get out their vehicles. It's that protective metal shell, remember? So they shout and gesticulate a bit, then they go on their way muttering and fuming.
Right, but what about those cases where they force a car off the road and cause a collision? Surely that would be taken as an assault?
Far from it. Many are dealt with as driving offences. There would have to be a lot of premeditation and malice aforethought for the lawyers to treat it as anything other than dangerous driving.
Why?
Because it's much easier to prove. The intent is less important. It's all about the manner of driving.
Right, so on a crowded pavement, two people bump into each other and start arguing. One of them pushes the other person over. So that's an offence of dangerous walking, is it?
Well, good point. But I think you've highlighted how the car has assumed a unique status in all of our lives. It's revered as a status symbol.
Of course, the airbags and the crumple zones, all those security features, they're all introduced to make the driver feel safer, invincible almost, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
Did you know that 61% of motorists in the UK say that they've suffered from a road rage attack while driving? This can either be physical or verbal, and 3/4 of drivers said they'd experienced a threatening gesture from another road user. That means 80% of drivers, 4 out of every 5 drivers, have experienced road rage aggression. And interestingly, as you suggested, Jack, only 6% of those incidents get reported to the police.
Here's a definition of road rage that we found. It is a motorist's uncontrolled anger that is usually provoked by another motorist's irritating act and is expressed as aggressive or violent behaviour.
Another reason people get mad on the road is because of something transport psychologists call democratic about the road. There are apparently 3 triggers that can cause road rage: impeding progress, reckless driving, and direct hostility. And it's these actions that break the rules of the road system, and that causes road rage. And when you're in a car, you can't necessarily voice your frustrations in a way that you would like to. So you resort to hand gestures, slamming on the horn, or using your headlights. Being stuck in traffic, roadworks, and being stressed can make these frustrations much worse and can make people more impatient when they get behind the wheel. So in conclusion, road rage can be caused by a number of things, but people are still looking at the psychology behind it.
The Stephen Cameron murder is the worst imaginable consequence of what began as what is sadly an everyday occurrence on British roads. Kenneth Noye was a bomb waiting to explode, a bundle of fury released from prison too soon. The encounter at Swanley Interchange was the perfect storm. Noye was a violent man. He'd already killed a cop and got away with it.
But was he a psychopath? Well, when the red mist came down, he definitely behaved like one. Maybe we should ask him to complete one of those 20-point PCLR psychopath tests. Word has it Mr. Noye is in the Kent area. In 2020, newspapers reported that he'd visited the exact spot of the fatal stabbing on the 24th anniversary of Stephen Cameron's murder. So, Mr. Noye, if you're listening, you can reach us on Twitter. We're at psychokillerpo, or through our website, psycho-killer.co. But, to answer the question, no, I don't think Kenneth Noye is a psychopath. He's just a short-tempered bastard who's used to getting his own way.
If you'd like to take a scientifically approved psychopath test, head over to psycho-killer.co, where you'll find a link to the real deal.
Our thanks to ITV News and Sky News for the archive clips in this podcast. And now it's goodbye from Jack and from me. We'll see you again soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer shocking true crime story.